of Sweden Section Office Yankung to have the opening remarks. Yeah, Carl, please come.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. First of all, let me say that I'm very honored to be given the opportunity to provide a few opening remarks today. It's a very important book launch, and I'm very grateful for that. Before I start, I just want to mention that I'm a newcomer to Myanmar. I've been living there since August last year, and I do not have the benefit of expensive experience working with the country. But fortunately, the caliber of the panel that's here today and the people who have written this book is completely different, and the knowledge is much more extensive and deep, of course. I also want to take a moment just to recognize the bravery of those who have written the contributions in this book and the people who are here presenting today. It's important to point that out. It's not risk-free, but it's important. So thank you to all of you. Let me start by just noting that the research that is being presented here today is valuable, I think not only from an academic perspective, but perhaps more importantly, because it provides insights and key perspectives on the fight that is going on today for a free, fair, and democratic Myanmar. And I also want to start by mentioning, I hope that is obvious to at least a lot of the people here, but it's important nonetheless. Speaking as an official representing the government of Sweden, we condemn the military coup in the strongest terms and all of the violence perpetrated by the Myanmar military against those opposing the coup. Immediately after the coup, the Swedish government decided to review all of its development support to ensure that no Swedish support should legitimize nor provide resources to the military. And this is what we've been doing ever since. We also underline that all those responsible for human rights violations must be held accountable, and we need an end to the violence, and the country must return to a path of freedom, respect for human rights, and democracy as soon as possible. Unfortunately, we all know that that's pretty far from the reality today. And the situation and the costs of the conflict keeps increasing day by day. We've heard too many times the figures and the terrible impact the conflict is having in terms of casualties, displacement, political persecution and human rights violations, and increasing humanitarian costs day by day across the country. As always, women often bear the brunt of these costs. And make no mistake, the military is the reason we are seeing this. They are to blame, and they can make it stop. We also need to remind ourselves of the impact the conflict is having on the future of the country. Social spending is a fraction of what it was and what it needs to be, as more money is being poured into the military. Health and education systems have all but stopped functioning, as teachers and health professionals have joined the civil disobedience movement. This means that the future of far too many girls and boys across the country is being taken away from them. Based on the principal stance I mentioned, Sweden has been providing support to a range of civil society organizations working for a democratic Myanmar. We work with different actors on constitution drafting based on federalism and respect for human rights. We support human rights defenders and those monitoring human rights violations so that perpetrators can be held accountable. We work with independent media to ensure that they can survive and provide accurate reports of what is actually happening on the ground. Their work is crucial for the world to keep having its eye on Myanmar. For many years, gender equality has been, and it continues to be, a key priority for the Swedish government. Sweden takes pride in standing together with the women human rights defenders in Myanmar that, despite severe risks for their lives, continue to stand up against the military. Women who are often the first to respond to the needs of local communities. And we couple all of this financial support with an effort to remain a strong and steadfast voice in the international community to not let Myanmar slip off the global agenda. We will continue to remain a voice for an end to violence and a free, open, and democratic Myanmar. Any viable process towards peace and reconciliation must be a process that is genuinely inclusive, based on fundamental respect for human rights and equality. While the picture today is very grim, and most likely it will get worse before it gets better, I would, however, want to point out one silver lining. It's a silver lining that, perhaps faint, I think it's also quite important, and it's also hinted at in the book that is being presented here today. The coup seems to have opened up a space for discussion and debates about inequalities and discrimination in Myanmar in a way that has not been seen for a very long time, if ever. One seasoned democracy activist told me that in her view, this is the first time since independence that there is a serious chance to discuss and address the fundamental exclusions that are at the root of so many of the problems of Myanmar. The question, of course, is how to seize these opportunities, how to ensure that the perspectives that are key in this book that is being presented here today and that are debated in NUCC and in other forums, how do we ensure that that actually leads to change for women and men on the ground? And that is a difficult question. And one point I found important in the book as I was reading through it is that during the period between 2011 and 2021, there was a reduction of armed violence, of course, across the country, but structural forms of violence that disproportionately affect women, that persisted. And such structural patterns do not go away just because a conflict ends. As is pointed out in several chapters of the book, it's about changing deep-seated cultural norms and patterns, and this takes time, but it can happen. And it starts with acknowledgement and speaking openly about these patterns. And that's why this book and other discussions are so important. In my role, the one I have as the head of the Swedish section office in Yangon, in my discussions with my colleagues, we tend to focus on the broader picture at the macro level. Where is the country heading? How can we engage with neighboring countries? How do we approach negotiations in the UN, etc.? We speculate about viable exit strategies and if these will be acceptable to the various neighbor countries. But at the end of the day, what matters is, of course, the reality on the ground for women and men and girls and boys. If the perspectives of those marginalized are not taken into account, no durable solution can be found to the problems of the country. And it's there that research, such as the one that is being presented here today, helps us, because it provides perspectives, it enhances our understanding, and if we don't have that understanding, all of our good intentions are at serious risk of being misdirected, and our analysis will be flawed. The research, such as this one, also challenges harmful gender norms, and the sooner we realize that gender equality is at the core of conflict resolution, the sooner we will be able to see peace flourish. So therefore, I'm very happy and grateful that I've been invited here today. We need to meet and listen to the voices of those that are represented on this panel and the book and all of those interviewed in the book, because it helps us design policies, tools, and interventions in a better way. So again, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing the outcome of the presentation.
Thank you, the ambassadors, for your comprehensive speech on the important matters, and glad to know the role of the Swedish government that's planning to do in advance for the situation in Myanmar. Okay, so now I think you would like to know about the book, and then it's ready. I would like to invite two professors. One is Jenny Hedstorm, Associate Professors in War Studies at Swedish Defense Universities as the editors, and Elizabeth Olivius, Associate Professors in Political Science at Upheaval Universities. Both of them are the editors. So now please come to elaborate more on the book. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Pia, and thank you so much for all the work that the Fort and especially you have done in pulling all of this together. And of course, thank you to Carl for opening up this whole panel discussion. So the reason we wrote this particular book is because the familiar story of Myanmar, as told during the transitional years, was often told as this success story, right? So according to most observers and international investors, Myanmar's decade of transition was a successful one. Poverty diminished, conflict receded, households were empowered, and so on. And in many ways, it was a successful story, but a closer look at the events and the struggles that together makes up the lived reality of that transition tells a different and more complicated story. So in this book, we wanted to tell this more complicated story. We wanted to illuminate the many different events and changes and setbacks that took place during the transitional years in order to tell a different story about Myanmar, a story in which women are protagonists and actors, and gender changes, whether in the informal sphere, such as in the households or in the land, or in formal places, such as in politics or in the law, are at stake. We wanted to highlight stories that celebrate the strategies and the successes of the women's movement to try to outlaw domestic violence, to engender peace, to change norms in the everyday. But they were also honest about the many insecurities, contradictions, and compromises that the transition entailed, and the wars and the violence that followed in its wake. So rather than telling this one story about Myanmar, one that follows this trajectory of sort of upwards progress of that transition as somehow inevitable, leading towards a liberal democracy, we wanted to have a collective take on the transitional decade to make visible the many interlinked events, changes, and conflicts that together made up the transitional years and hinted at the troubles that happened later. So in order to tell these stories, these more complicated stories, this book brings together a collection of feminist scholars and activists from Myanmar and beyond to explore and describe different aspects of the transition and what led up to it. And the choice to include primarily junior voices interspersed with the histories or her stories of activists were intentional. We didn't want to only critique the usual way of telling stories about Myanmar, but we wanted to provide an outlet for a different kind of storytelling. And for different kinds of knowledge to emerge, one in which multiple truths can be held at the same time, that transition as neither success nor failure, but as a lived and complicated reality. And in an illuminating twist is worth highlighting that we were able to gather this collection of voices primarily because of that transition. So however flawed it was, it still enabled us to sort of collectively meet and gather this knowledge and reflect on Myanmar's history that was difficult to do before that transition, and is even more difficult to do today after the coup. And we were halfway through this book when the coup took place. So at one of our workshops, which we held online, we could hear gunshots from across the street in Yangon. We didn't hear from one of the authors for 3 days when she tried to leave the country. We didn't know if she made it out okay. The coup is not an abstract event, sort of a case to